Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives, where tonight we're embarking on an extraordinary journey to Japan, a nation of islands that somehow managed to transform isolation into innovation, turning centuries of deliberate seclusion into one of history's most remarkable comebacks. From ancient pottery makers who invented breakfast cereal bowls 12,000 years before cereal existed, to modern engineers who made trains so punctual they apologize for being 20 seconds late, Japan's story defies every rule about how civilizations are supposed to develop. Tonight, we'll trace this incredible arc from volcanic beginnings to economic miracle, discovering how a collection of rice farming villages became a technological superpower, survived being forcibly opened by foreign warships, embraced modernization at breakneck speed, endured devastating defeat, and then achieved prosperity that made their former conquerors nervous. It's a tale of samurai and silicon chips, of emperors and economic miracles, of a people who proved that sometimes the best way forward is to master change while staying true to yourself. If you're new here and enjoy falling asleep to the soothing chaos of human civilization, hit that subscribe button because trust me, after 12,000 years of Japanese ingenuity, you'll want to see what other nations have been up to while you weren't paying attention. And as always, let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. So grab your favourite pillow, settle into something comfortable, and let's begin this journey through the land of the rising Sunday. Chapter 1. The Islands Emerge, Geography and Ancient Origins. Picture, if you will, a chain of islands sitting in the Pacific Ocean, like stepping stones, placed by a particularly ambitious giant with excellent taste in real estate. Japan consists of 6,852 islands, though only about 430 of them are inhabited, which means there are thousands of perfectly good islands just sitting there empty, probably wondering why they didn't get chosen for the population lottery. Some of these uninhabited islands are so small that ambitious seagulls could claim them as personal kingdoms, while others remain empty because they're either too mountainous, too volcanic, or too fond of hosting the occasional tsunami. The four main islands that form the heart of Japan are Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, and Shikoku. Honshu is the largest and most populous, stretching roughly 810 miles from north to south and containing major cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto. It's essentially Japan's overachieving eldest child, handling most of the important business while the other islands watch with a mixture of admiration and mild resentment. Honshu contains about 60% of Japan's population, making it a masterclass in efficient space utilization. Hokkaido, the northernmost island, is Japan's equivalent of Canada. It's big, it's cold, and it's full of natural beauty that makes people from warmer climates feel both inspired and slightly hypothermic. The island wasn't fully integrated into Japan until the late 19th century, making it something of a latecomer to the Japanese family dinner table. Before that, it was primarily inhabited by the Ainu people, who had their own distinct culture and probably viewed the eventual Japanese settlement with the enthusiasm typically reserved for uninvited house guests. Kyushu, the southernmost of the main islands, has always been Japan's window to the outside world, primarily because it's the closest to the Asian mainland. Throughout history, this has meant that Kyushu residents have had the privilege of being the first to meet foreign visitors, whether they were friendly Buddhist monks bringing enlightenment, or somewhat less friendly Mongol armies bringing considerably less enlightenment. The island has a population of about 13 million people who have grown accustomed to being Japan's cultural ambassadors. Shikoku, the smallest of the four main islands, sits between Honshu and Kyushu like a modest middle child, quietly minding its own business and occasionally reminding everyone that it exists too. It's famous for its 88 temple pilgrimage route, which involves walking over 700 miles to visit all the temples, proving that the Japanese have always understood that the best spiritual experiences involve a considerable amount of walking and probably some blisters. The geological story of Japan reads like a particularly dramatic novel written by the Earth itself, complete with plot twists and explosive climaxes. The islands sit at the intersection of four major tectonic plates: the Pacific, Philippine Sea, Eurasian, and North American plates, making Japan one of the most seismically active places on Earth. It's as if the planet decided to conduct an ongoing geology experiment and chose Japan as the laboratory, complete with frequent earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and hot springs as consolation prizes. This geological activity has blessed Japan with over 100 active volcanoes, including the iconic Mount Fuji, which last erupted in 1707 and has been remarkably well behaved ever since, like a reformed troublemaker who's found religion. Mount Fuji stands 12,389 feet tall and is considered so sacred that climbing it during certain seasons is forbidden, though this doesn't stop roughly 300,000 people from making the ascent annually. The volcanic activity has also created numerous hot springs, or onsen, which the Japanese have turned into an art form involving relaxation, mineral water, and very specific etiquette. The Japanese archipelago experiences approximately 1,500 earthquakes per year, though most are too small to notice unless you happen to be a seismograph. The larger earthquakes have shaped Japanese architecture, engineering, and cultural attitudes in profound ways, leading to building techniques that prioritize flexibility over rigid strength and a national mentality that views natural disasters as unfortunate but inevitable parts of life. The climate of Japan varies dramatically from north to south, creating distinct regional characteristics that have influenced everything from architecture to cuisine. Hokkaido experiences long, snowy winters that would make a Siberian husky feel at home, with temperatures that can drop to minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Meanwhile, Okinawa enjoys a subtropical climate where palm trees grow year-round, causing considerable confusion among first-time visitors who packed for both extremes. Most of Japan experiences 4 distinct seasons, a fact that Japanese people will mention with the same pride that Italians discuss pasta. Spring brings the famous cherry blossoms, or sakura, which create a national obsession involving weather forecasts dedicated entirely to predicting when specific trees will bloom. The cherry blossom season involves millions of people gathering under blooming trees for picnics and parties, transforming the entire country into an enormous outdoor celebration. Summer in Japan brings high temperatures and humidity levels that can make the air feel thick, along with a rainy season called tsuyu that ensures everything stays pleasantly damp for several weeks. Autumn provides relief from the summer heat and spectacular displays of fall foliage, while winter brings snow to much of the country and gives everyone an excuse to eat warming foods and soak in hot springs. The first people to call these islands home were the Jomon people, who arrived roughly 16,000 years ago during the last ice age, when sea levels were lower and the journey from the Asian mainland was considerably less daunting. The name Jomon means cord-patterned, referring to their distinctive pottery decorated with rope impressions, proving that even in prehistoric times, Japanese craftsmanship involved attention to decorative detail. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Jomon people were among the first in the world to develop pottery, creating ceramic vessels as early as 14,000 BCE. Jomon society lasted an impressive 14,000 years, making it one of the longest-running cultures in human history, and putting most modern governments to shame in terms of longevity and stability. They were hunter-gatherers who developed surprisingly sophisticated pottery technology, created elaborate earthenwork monuments, and managed to maintain a relatively stable society for longer than most modern nations have existed. The Jomon people lived in permanent settlements despite being hunter-gatherers, which was unusual for their time and suggests they had access to abundant natural resources. The Jomon people lived in pit houses constructed by digging circular depressions in the ground and covering them with wooden frameworks and thatched roofs, creating dwellings that were energy efficient, earthquake resistant, and probably quite cozy during Japan's winters. They hunted deer and wild boar using bows and arrows, gathered nuts, berries, and shellfish, and apparently had enough leisure time to create intricate clay figurines called dogu. These figurines feature large eyes, elaborate decorations, and expressions that suggest they were either deeply spiritual or mildly concerned about something. Archaeologists have spent considerable time debating what these dogu figurines represent, with theories ranging from fertility symbols to representations of deities to ancient action figures, because humans have always needed something to argue about. The figurines are often found broken, leading some researchers to suggest they were deliberately destroyed as part of rituals. Around 300 BCE, the Jomon culture began to be replaced by the Yayoi culture, named after a district in Tokyo where their pottery was first discovered. The Yayoi people brought revolutionary technologies from the Korean peninsula, including wet rice cultivation, bronze working, and iron tools, fundamentally transforming Japanese society. The transition from Jomon to Yayoi wasn't a sudden conquest, but rather a gradual cultural transformation. Rice cultivation was perhaps the most significant change brought by the Yayoi people, as it allowed for permanent settlements, population growth, and the development of social hierarchies based on who controlled the best rice paddies. This marked the beginning of Japan's long and continuing relationship with rice, which would become so central to Japanese culture that the word for cooked rice, gohan, also means meal in general, because apparently the Japanese couldn't conceive of eating without rice present. The introduction of rice farming also led to the development of irrigation systems, agricultural tools, and storage facilities. The Yayoi period also saw the introduction of metalworking, with bronze being used primarily for ceremonial objects and weapons that were probably more impressive looking than practically effective in actual combat. Iron tools, on the other hand, revolutionized agriculture and daily life, proving that while bronze might win style points and look magnificent in museum displays, iron gets the job done. The Yayoi people also brought new forms of pottery that were less decorative than Jomon ceramics, but more practical for everyday use, suggesting a cultural shift toward functionality over artistic expression. During this period, Japanese society began developing the social stratification that would characterize much of its later history. Archaeological evidence suggests the emergence of powerful chieftains who controlled large territories and could command the labor necessary to build impressive burial mounds, because apparently humans have always needed ways to demonstrate status that involve moving large amounts of dirt. These burial mounds, called kofun, became increasingly elaborate during the later Yayoi period and the subsequent Kofun period, with some reaching lengths of over 1,500 feet. The spiritual beliefs of ancient Japan centered around what would later be called Shinto, meaning the way of the gods, or the way of the kami. Shinto is an indigenous religion that sees divine spirits, or kami, in natural phenomena, objects and places. Mountains, rivers, trees, rocks and other natural features all potentially housed kami, making the natural world a sacred landscape that required respectful treatment. This animistic worldview meant that the Japanese developed a deep connection to their natural environment, viewing themselves as part of a larger spiritual ecosystem rather than its masters. This spiritual framework meant that every significant natural feature had its own personality and preferences, rather like dealing with an extremely large extended family where everyone has strong opinions about how things should be done and gets offended if you don't remember their birthday. Kami could be benevolent and helpful if treated properly, or mischievous and destructive if neglected or insulted, creating a religious system that emphasized maintaining good relationships with the spiritual world through regular rituals and offerings. The mythology of ancient Japan, recorded much later in texts like the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, tells of the creation of the islands by the divine couple Izanagi and Izanami, who stood on the floating bridge of heaven and stirred the ocean with a jewelled spear. When they lifted the spear, drops of brine fell from its tip and formed the first island, Onogoro. From there, they created the other islands of Japan, proving that even in mythology, the Japanese understood the importance of starting with a solid foundation and building systematically. According to these creation myths, the sun goddess Amaterasu was born from Izanagi's left eye when he washed his face after returning from the underworld, making her one of the most important deities in the Shinto pantheon and proving that even divine personal hygiene can have world-changing consequences. Amaterasu became the ruler of the heavens and the ancestral deity of the imperial family, establishing a divine lineage that connected the earthly rulers to the celestial realm, which was an extremely effective way of discouraging political opposition. The early Japanese also developed sophisticated burial practices, with the Yayoi period seeing the construction of moated precincts around burial sites and the inclusion of mirrors, swords, and curved beads as grave goods. These three types of objects would later become the imperial regalia of Japan, connecting the prehistoric past to the historical present. As we reach the end of this first section, we find ourselves at the threshold between prehistory and history, with the foundation stones of Japanese civilization firmly in place. The islands have emerged from the sea through geological drama, been populated by innovative peoples who learn to work with rather than against their environment, and developed spiritual beliefs that would continue to influence Japanese culture for millennia to come. The stage is set for the next chapter of our journey, where Chinese influence will arrive like a cultural tsunami, bringing writing, Buddhism, and new forms of government that will transform these islands once again. Chapter 2. The Classical Age, Emperors, Buddhism, and Borrowed Brilliance. As we continue our journey through Japanese history, we find ourselves in the 6th century CE, when Japan was about to experience what could be described as the world's most successful cultural makeover. The islands that had quietly developed their own unique civilization were suddenly exposed to the full force of Chinese and Korean culture, arriving like a particularly well-educated tsunami carrying Buddhism, writing systems, and governmental ideas that would reshape Japanese society forever. The transformation began in earnest during the Asuka period, which lasted from approximately 538 to 710 CE. The period takes its name from the Asuka region, where the imperial court established itself, and where some of the most significant changes in Japanese history would unfold. It was during this era that Japan began its remarkable ability to absorb foreign influences while maintaining its own distinct character, a skill that would serve it well throughout history. Buddhism arrived in Japan in 538 CE, brought by envoys from the Korean kingdom of Baekje, who presumably thought the Japanese needed some spiritual guidance along with their political alliance. The introduction of Buddhism wasn't exactly smooth sailing. The powerful Soga clan embraced it enthusiastically, while the rival Mononobe clan viewed it with the same suspicion typically reserved for door-to-door salesmen. This theological disagreement eventually escalated into armed conflict because apparently nothing says peaceful religion quite like a good old-fashioned war over whether to adopt it. The Soga clan emerged victorious in 587 CE, which meant Buddhism became the fashionable new faith among the Japanese elite. However, this wasn't simply a matter of replacing Shinto with Buddhism. The Japanese demonstrated their characteristic pragmatism by deciding that having multiple religions was better than having just one, rather like collecting different types of insurance policies for the afterlife. The most influential figure of this period was Prince Shotoku, whose name literally means virtuous virtue, suggesting that either his parents had high expectations or a limited imagination when it came to naming children. Born in 574 CE, Shotoku served as regent under Empress Suiko from 593 until his death in 622 CE, during which time he managed to transform Japan's political and cultural landscape. Prince Shotoku was essentially Japan's first great multitasker, simultaneously serving as a political leader, Buddhist scholar, constitutional theorist, and cultural ambassador. He wrote commentaries on Buddhist sutras, established temples, reformed the government, and somehow found time to engage in diplomatic correspondence with China, where he had the audacity to address the Chinese emperor as an equal, referring to Japan as the land of the rising sun, writing to the land of the setting sun. In 604 CE, Shotoku promulgated the 17-article constitution, which wasn't really a constitution in the modern sense, but rather a set of moral and political guidelines that combined Buddhist ethics, Confucian philosophy, and Japanese common sense. The constitution emphasized harmony, respect for authority, and the importance of proper bureaucratic procedure, establishing principles that would influence Japanese governance for centuries to come. Under Shotoku's guidance, Japan also established the 12-level cap and rank system in 603 CE, which replaced hereditary positions with a merit-based system indicated by differently coloured caps. This meant that court officials could now be judged not only by their abilities but also by their fashion sense, creating what was probably history's first example of government by haberdashery. The period saw an explosion of temple construction, with Shotoku founding several major Buddhist temples, including Horyuji in 607 CE. These temples weren't just places of worship but also centers of learning, art, and culture, where monks studied Buddhist texts, created magnificent sculptures and paintings, and presumably engaged in the occasional theological debate about the proper way to achieve enlightenment. Japanese missions to China became a regular feature of this period, with official embassies departing every few years to study Chinese government, technology, arts, and philosophy. These missions were significant undertakings. Imagine a combination of diplomatic mission, study abroad program, an extremely dangerous field trip, all rolled into one. Many students stayed in China for decades, returning to Japan with new ideas, technologies, and presumably some interesting stories about their travels. The adoption of Chinese writing was perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of this cultural borrowing. Chinese characters, designed for a language completely different from Japanese, had to be adapted to express Japanese words and concepts. The result was a writing system of remarkable complexity that combined Chinese characters with Japanese phonetic elements, creating what scholars politely describe as challenging, and what everyone else calls really, really difficult. In 710 CE, the capital was moved to Heijō-kyo, near present-day Nara, marking the beginning of the Nara period. The new capital was modelled directly on the Chinese Tang dynasty capital of Chang'an, complete with a grid pattern, broad avenues, and impressive government buildings. It was essentially Japan's attempt to build its own version of the Chinese imperial capital, though presumably with better earthquake resistance. The Nara period, lasting from 710 to 794 CE, represented the height of Chinese influence in Japan. The government adopted Chinese-style administrative systems, legal codes, and court ceremonies. The Taiho Code, enacted in 701 CE, established a centralized government structure based on Chinese models, complete with ministries, provinces, and an elaborate bureaucracy. Buddhism continued to flourish during the Nara period, with the construction of massive temples and the creation of the great Buddha statue at Todaiji Temple. This bronze statue, completed in 752 CE, stood nearly 50 feet tall and required enormous amounts of copper, tin, and lead. The project was so massive that it temporarily exhausted Japan's supply of bronze, proving that major construction projects have always had a tendency to go over budget. However, the growing power of Buddhist temples began to concern the imperial court. Monks accumulated wealth and political influence, sometimes involving themselves in court politics in ways that went beyond their spiritual duties. The situation became particularly problematic when the monk Dokyo gained significant influence over Empress Shotoku, leading to fears that the Buddhist clergy might attempt to usurp imperial authority. In 794 CE, Emperor Kamu decided to move the capital again, this time to Heian-kyo, present-day Kyoto. The move was partly motivated by a desire to escape the influence of the powerful Nara temples and create a fresh start for imperial government. The new capital would remain Japan's political center for over 1,000 years, making it one of the longest-serving capitals in world history. The Heian period, beginning in 794 CE, marked a gradual shift away from direct Chinese influence toward a more distinctly Japanese culture. While Chinese learning remained important, Japan began developing its own artistic styles, literary traditions, and governmental practices. It was during this period that Japan truly began to find its own cultural voice, like a teenager finally developing their own sense of style after years of copying their older sibling. The political structure of the Heian period was dominated by the Fujiwara clan, who achieved power through a brilliant strategy of marrying their daughters to emperors and then serving as regents for their grandsons. This created a system where the Fujiwara essentially controlled the imperial government while maintaining the fiction that the emperor held supreme authority. It was political puppetry raised to an art form. Heian court culture became increasingly refined and sophisticated, developing elaborate ceremonies, artistic pursuits, and social customs that emphasized aesthetic sensitivity and cultural accomplishment. Court nobles spent their time composing poetry, practicing calligraphy, playing musical instruments, and engaging in complex romantic relationships that would provide material for future novelists. It was a lifestyle that prioritized beauty, refinement, and cultural achievement over military prowess. The development of Japanese writing systems during the Heian period was particularly significant. While men continued to write in Chinese for official documents, court women began using hiragana, a cursive syllabary that could express Japanese sounds more naturally. This innovation allowed for distinctly Japanese literature, much written by court ladies who had education and leisure time to document court life. The tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu around the year 1000 CE, is often considered the world's first novel. This massive work follows the romantic adventures of Prince Genji and provides an intimate portrait of Heian court life, complete with elaborate ceremonies, complex relationships, and enough palace intrigue to keep readers engaged for over 1,000 pages. The novel's psychological depth and literary sophistication established standards for Japanese literature that continue to influence writers today. Murasaki Shikibu herself was a court lady who served Empress Shoshi and managed to create a masterpiece while navigating the complex social dynamics of imperial court life. Another remarkable literary work of the period was The Pillow Book by Sei Shonagon, a collection of observations and anecdotes about court life that provides an intimate glimpse into Heian aristocracy. Sei Shonagon had strong opinions about everything from flower arranging to annoying court personalities, creating a work that feels surprisingly modern in its wit and humour. Her famous opening line demonstrates the Heian aesthetic that found profound meaning in natural phenomena. The poetry of the Heian period reached extraordinary heights, with the 31-syllable waka form becoming the preferred vehicle for expression. Court nobles exchanged poems as part of daily social interactions, using carefully chosen words and seasonal imagery to convey complex thoughts. A poorly composed poem could damage one's reputation, while an elegant verse might advance social standing. Poetry competitions became major social events. The visual arts developed a distinctly Japanese aesthetic that differed from Chinese models. Painting styles emphasized flowing lines, subtle colors, and emotional expression over formal compositions. The famous flying cloud technique in scroll paintings created dreamlike narratives. Architecture evolved with the Shinden-zukuri style, featuring elegant wooden buildings connected by covered corridors and surrounded by gardens. Court music and dance combined influences from China, Korea, and indigenous Japanese traditions to create new art forms. Gagaku court music featured complex instrumental arrangements played on imported instruments like the biwa lute and koto zither, while bugaku dance performances told stories through elaborate movements. These performances were integral parts of ceremonies that reinforced social hierarchies. The daily life of Heian court nobles revolved around intricate customs and ceremonies that governed everything from clothing colours to romantic relationships. Women wielded considerable cultural influence despite limited formal political power, serving as arbiters of taste who could make or break social reputations. The famous layering of kimono became an art form requiring knowledge of seasonal associations. Religious life during the Heian period blended Buddhist practices with Shinto traditions in ways that created a uniquely Japanese spiritual landscape. Pure Land Buddhism became increasingly popular, offering salvation through faith rather than complex philosophical study. Amida Buddha's Western paradise provided comfort during uncertain times, while elaborate funeral rites became important demonstrations of family status. Heian period aesthetics emphasized concepts like mono-no-aware, the pathos of things, which appreciated the transient nature of beauty and life. This philosophical outlook found expression in art, literature, and daily life, creating a cultural sensibility that valued subtle emotional responses. Cherry blossoms became a particularly potent symbol, representing the brief but intense beauty that characterized the Heian worldview. Buddhism during the Heian period developed in new directions, with esoteric sects like Tendai and Shingon that emphasized complex rituals, meditation practices, and philosophical study. These forms appealed to the sophisticated tastes of the Heian court, offering spiritual practices that complemented the refined cultural pursuits. Monks became scholars and artists as well as religious practitioners. However, the refined world of the Heian court was increasingly disconnected from practical realities of governing Japan. While court nobles composed poetry and debated aesthetic principles, provincial administration was left to local officials who gradually accumulated power and resources. The elegant ceremonies and cultural achievements masked growing weakness in the imperial government's actual ability to control the country. As the classical age progressed, new challenges emerged that would test Japan's Chinese-influenced governmental system. The rise of private estates, growth of regional power centers, and development of warrior bands in the provinces pointed towards significant changes ahead. The cultural brilliance of the classical age had created sophisticated civilization, but it remained to be seen whether this elegant system could adapt to the more martial challenges emerging from beyond the capital's carefully manicured gardens. The classical age of Japanese history demonstrates the remarkable capacity of Japanese civilization to absorb and transform foreign influences while maintaining its distinct character. Buddhism, Chinese governmental systems, and continental learning all became thoroughly Japanese through cultural adaptation. The foundations laid during the Asuka, Nara, and early Heian periods would continue to influence Japanese culture, religion, and governance for centuries to come, even as the country prepared to enter a new phase dominated by warriors rather than courtiers. Chapter 3: Warriors and Warlords. The Age of the Samurai. As our journey through Japanese history continues, we find ourselves entering one of the most dramatic and transformative periods in the nation's development. The elegant court culture of the Heian period, with its poetry competitions and aesthetic refinements, was about to be swept aside by the rise of a warrior class that would dominate Japan for the next 7 centuries. This is the story of how sword-carrying provincial fighters became the rulers of an entire civilization, creating a military society that would define Japanese identity for generations to come. The transformation began during the late Heian period, when the central government in Kyoto found itself increasingly unable to maintain order in the distant provinces. While court nobles spent their time perfecting the art of layering silk robes and composing 31-syllable poems, practical problems like bandits, tax collection, and territorial disputes were being handled by local military families who had both the weapons and the willingness to use them. These provincial warriors, initially called bushi, emerged from various backgrounds. Some were descended from younger sons of the imperial family, who had been given surnames and sent to the provinces to make their own fortunes. Others were local strongmen who had accumulated land, followers, and the military skills necessary to protect both. What they shared was a practical approach to problem solving that generally involved horses, swords, and the conviction that might often makes right. 2 clans in particular rose to prominence during this period, the Taira and the Minamoto. The Taira, also known as the Heike, had established themselves as a powerful military force and had even managed to gain significant influence at the imperial court. Their leader, Taira no Kiyomori, became so powerful that he essentially controlled the government, marrying his daughters into the imperial family and placing his infant grandson on the throne as Emperor Antoku. The Minamoto clan, also called the Genji, had suffered a severe setback in 1160 when their leader Minamoto no Yoshitomo was defeated and killed by the Taira. However, Yoshitomo's son Yoritomo was spared due to his youth and exiled to the Izu Peninsula, where he spent the next 20 years learning patience, political strategy, and presumably harbouring the kind of grudges that would make a soap opera writer proud. The spark that ignited the final confrontation came in 1180, when Prince Mochihito, a son of Emperor Go-Shirakawa, who had been passed over in the imperial succession, issued a call to arms against the Taira. The prince enlisted the support of Minamoto no Yorimasa, an aging warrior who commanded respect among the military class. Though both Mochihito and Yorimasa were quickly killed by Taira forces, their rebellion had lit a fuse that would explode into nationwide civil war. Minamoto no Yoritomo, now 33 years old and thoroughly prepared for his moment, raised his own banner in response to the prince's call. His initial attempt at rebellion nearly ended in disaster when he suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Ishibashiyama in August 1180. With a handful of followers, Yoritomo fled into the mountains of the Hakone Pass, probably wondering if 20 years of exile had been adequate preparation for actual warfare. However, Yoritomo possessed something more valuable than military genius: political acumen. Rather than simply gathering warriors to fight for him, he began offering concrete incentives to potential allies. He confirmed land holdings, promised rewards for service, and gradually built a coalition that combined practical self-interest with family loyalty. By the time he engaged the Taira again at the Battle of Fujigawa in November 1180, his forces had grown so substantially that the Taira army fled without even fighting, apparently convinced that discretion was indeed the better part of valour. What followed was the Genpei War, named after the alternate readings of the characters for Minamoto, Gen, and Taira, Hei. This 5-year conflict would determine not only which clan would dominate Japan, but whether the country would continue to be ruled by court nobles or be governed by a military class. It was fought across the length of Japan, from the northern provinces to the southern islands, and featured some of the most famous battles in Japanese history. The war's most celebrated figure was probably Minamoto no Yoshitsune, Yoritomo's younger half-brother, who possessed the kind of tactical brilliance and personal charisma that legends are made of. Yoshitsune's victories at battles like Ichi-no-Tani and Yashima demonstrated innovative tactics and inspired leadership that made him a hero to his troops and a headache for his enemies. Unfortunately for Yoshitsune, his military genius was matched only by his political naivety, a combination that would later prove fatal. The Genpei War reached its climax at the naval battle of Dan no Ura in 1185, fought in the narrow straits between Honshu and Kyushu. The Taira, who controlled a powerful fleet, initially held the advantage. However, the tide literally turned against them when key allies defected to the Minamoto side during the battle. Faced with inevitable defeat, many Taira warriors and nobles chose death over surrender, with the child Emperor Antoku drowning along with his grandmother and the sacred imperial regalia. The destruction of the Taira marked the end of the old order and the beginning of what historians call Japan's medieval period. Minamoto no Yoritomo, now the undisputed military leader of Japan, faced the challenge of converting battlefield victory into a stable system of government. Rather than attempting to rule from Kyoto alongside the imperial court, he established his headquarters at Kamakura, a small coastal town that offered both strategic advantages and symbolic separation from the old aristocratic capital. In 1192, the retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa granted Yoritomo the title of Sei Taishogun, literally, barbarian subduing great general, making him the first shogun to hold effective control over all of Japan. The Kamakura shogunate represented a revolutionary new form of government that balanced imperial legitimacy with military practicality. The emperor remained the theoretical source of all authority, but real power was exercised by the shogun and his warrior administrators. Yoritomo's system was elegantly simple and brutally effective. He appointed military governors called shugo to control the provinces and estate stewards known as jito to oversee individual land holdings. These positions were filled by samurai who owed their appointments to the shogun and could be dismissed by him, creating a chain of loyalty that ran from the local level directly to Kamakura rather than through the old court aristocracy. The new government faced its first major test during the Mongol invasions of 1274 and 1281. Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson and emperor of Yuan China, had unified China and Korea under Mongol rule and now demanded that Japan submit to his authority. When the Japanese refused, he launched 2 massive invasion attempts that would test both the military capabilities of the samurai and their belief in divine protection. The first invasion in 1274 involved approximately 30,000 troops carried by 800 ships. The Mongols easily captured the islands of Tsushima and Iki before landing on the shores of Hakata Bay in Kyushu. The Japanese defenders, fighting in their traditional style of individual combat and mounted archery, found themselves facing mass formations of infantry armed with weapons they had never encountered, including early forms of gunpowder bombs. However, the Mongol advantage proved temporary. A severe storm struck the invasion fleet while it was anchored in Hakata Bay, sinking many ships and forcing the survivors to retreat to Korea. The Japanese interpreted this meteorological intervention as divine protection, calling the storm kamikaze, meaning divine wind. The idea that Japan was protected by the gods would have profound implications for Japanese military thinking for centuries to come. Learning from their first encounter with the Mongols, the Japanese spent the next 7 years preparing for another invasion. They constructed a stone defensive wall around Hakata Bay, organized their forces more effectively, and developed new tactics suited to fighting large-scale invasions rather than traditional samurai duels. When Kublai Khan launched his second invasion in 1281, with an even larger force of over 100,000 men, Japan was ready. The second invasion proved more challenging for both sides. The Mongol fleet, split into two separate armies from Korea and China, converged near Kyushu but found that the Japanese defences made landing difficult. For months, the invading forces remained aboard their ships, depleting their supplies and suffering from disease and the psychological stress of being trapped in enemy waters. Once again, a massive typhoon struck the fleet, this time causing even more devastating losses. The storm destroyed thousands of ships and drowned tens of thousands of warriors, permanently ending Mongol ambitions to conquer Japan. The successful defense against the Mongols enhanced the prestige of the warrior class and reinforced the shogunal system, but it also created new problems. The cost of maintaining defences had strained government finances, and warriors who had participated in the defence expected rewards. Unlike domestic conflicts, foreign invasions produced no new lands to distribute, leaving many samurai feeling that their service had gone unrewarded. This economic strain would contribute to the eventual weakening of the Kamakura system. The Kamakura shogunate faced internal challenges as well. Yoritomo died in 1199, possibly in a hunting accident, leaving the succession in the hands of his young sons. Real power, however, shifted to the Hojo family, Yoritomo's in-laws, who ruled as regents to increasingly powerless shogun. This unusual arrangement, where regents controlled shoguns, who theoretically controlled emperors, created a complex hierarchy that even medieval Japanese bureaucrats probably found confusing. By the early 14th century, the Kamakura system was showing signs of strain. Emperor Go-Daigo, inspired perhaps by dreams of imperial restoration or simply tired of being a figurehead, attempted to overthrow the shogunate and restore direct imperial rule. The Kemu Restoration of 1333 briefly succeeded in destroying the Hojo Regency, but Go-Daigo's government proved unable to satisfy the expectations of the warrior class that had supported his rebellion. Ashikaga Takauji, initially one of Go-Daigo's supporters, turned against the emperor and established a new shogunate in 1338. However, Go-Daigo refused to accept defeat and established a rival court in the mountain town of Yoshino, creating a period known as Nambokucho, the era of northern and southern courts. For 56 years, Japan had two competing imperial courts, each claiming legitimacy and each backed by different warrior factions. The Ashikaga shogunate, also known as the Muromachi shogunate after their headquarters in Kyoto, represented a different approach to military government than their Kamakura predecessors. Where the Hojo had maintained strict control through appointed officials, the Ashikaga relied more heavily on powerful regional lords called Shugo daimyo. These provincial magnates exercised considerable autonomy in exchange for nominal loyalty to the shogun, creating a more decentralized system that worked well when the shogun was strong but became problematic when central authority weakened. The Muromachi period saw significant cultural developments, including the flourishing of Zen Buddhism, the development of the tea ceremony, and the construction of architectural masterpieces like the Golden Pavilion and Silver Pavilion in Kyoto. However, it was also marked by increasing political instability, as Shugo daimyo became more independent, and conflicts over succession became more frequent and destructive. The system finally collapsed during the Onin War of 1467 to 1477, a conflict that began as a succession dispute within the Ashikaga family, but escalated into a nationwide civil war that devastated Kyoto and shattered what remained of central authority. The war's causes were complex, involving not only shogunal succession but also disputes within powerful families like the Hatakeyama and Shiba clans, creating a web of conflicting loyalties that drew most of Japan into armed conflict. The Onin War marked the beginning of the Sengoku period, the age of warring states when central government essentially ceased to exist and power devolved to individual daimyo who ruled their domains as independent kingdoms. For over a century, Japan experienced almost constant warfare as these regional lords fought to expand their territories or simply to survive in an increasingly chaotic political environment. This period of warfare paradoxically led to innovations in military technology, castle construction, and administrative systems as daimyo competed for advantages over their rivals. The introduction of firearms by Portuguese traders in 1543 added a new dimension to warfare, though the samurai adapted these weapons to their own tactical preferences rather than abandoning traditional fighting methods entirely. The age of the samurai had transformed Japan from a court-dominated society into a military civilization, where warriors held both political power and cultural prestige. The values of the warrior class, loyalty, honor, martial skill, and service to one's lord, became central to Japanese identity. Though the constant warfare of the Sengoku period would eventually end with national reunification, the samurai system and the military values it embodied would continue to shape Japanese society until the modern era. Chapter 4. The Closed Country, Edo Period Isolation and Innovation. As we continue our journey through Japanese history, we encounter one of the most fascinating paradoxes in human civilization: how a nation that deliberately cut itself off from the outside world managed to create one of the most sophisticated and culturally rich societies in history. The Edo period, lasting from 1603 to 1868, represents Japan's great experiment in isolation, where the Tokugawa shogunate attempted to create the world's first truly self-contained nation, complete with strict borders, regulated information, and a social system so rigid it would make a Swiss timepiece look casual. The architect of this remarkable transformation was Tokugawa Ieyasu, the man who finally succeeded in bringing order to the chaos of the Sengoku period. After his decisive victory at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, Ieyasu faced the challenge of not only ruling Japan but ensuring that the devastating civil wars would never return. His solution was characteristically thorough: create a system so stable, so carefully balanced, and so completely controlled that rebellion would become not just difficult but practically inconceivable. Ieyasu established his government at Edo, a small fishing village that would eventually become Tokyo, rather than ruling from the traditional capitals of Kyoto or Kamakura. This choice was both practical and symbolic. Practical because Edo's location in eastern Japan gave him control over the fertile Kanto plain, and symbolic because it demonstrated that this was a genuinely new beginning for Japanese governance. The Tokugawa would not be constrained by the traditions and expectations of previous capitals. The foundation of Tokugawa control was the Sankin Kotai system, perhaps the most elaborate and expensive method of preventing rebellion ever devised. Under this arrangement, all daimyo were required to maintain residences in Edo and spend alternate years in the capital, while their wives and children remained there permanently as what can only be described as very well-treated hostages. This system achieved multiple goals simultaneously. It kept potential rebels under surveillance, forced them to spend enormous sums on travel and duplicate households, and gradually transformed them from provincial warlords into court aristocrats dependent on shogunal favour. The social structure of Edo period Japan was codified into a rigid hierarchy known as the Shino-Kosho system, which ranked people according to their supposed contribution to society. At the top were the samurai, the warrior administrators who had theoretical monopoly on violence and government service. Below them came farmers, whose rice production fed the nation and whose taxes supported the government. Third were artisans, who created useful objects, and at the bottom were merchants, whose role in simply moving goods around was considered parasitic and socially worthless. This ranking system had the curious effect of placing the people with the least money at the top and those with the most money at the bottom, creating what modern economists would recognize as a complete disconnect between social status and economic reality. Samurai, forbidden from engaging in commerce, often found themselves deeply in debt to the merchants they supposedly outranked, leading to situations where the highest-ranking members of society were essentially dependent on the lowest-ranking ones for survival. The most distinctive feature of Tokugawa rule, however, was the policy known as sakoku, literally meaning closed country, though the term was actually coined much later by a scholar trying to describe the system retrospectively. Beginning in the 1630s, a series of increasingly restrictive edicts gradually sealed Japan off from most foreign contact, creating what was effectively the world's largest island fortress. The roots of this isolation policy lay in the Tokugawa government's growing concern about the destabilizing effects of foreign influence, particularly Christianity. European missionaries had arrived in the 16th century and had made significant numbers of converts, including some powerful daimyo. The shogunate viewed this foreign religion as a potential threat to social stability and political loyalty, particularly after the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637 to 1638, where Christian peasants had risen up against oppressive taxation. The isolation process began with the expulsion of Spanish traders in 1624, followed by increasingly harsh persecution of Christians. Japanese Christians were forced to trample on religious images in annual ceremonies called fumi, and those who refused faced torture and execution. The Portuguese were finally expelled in 1639, leaving only the Dutch and Chinese with permission to trade with Japan, and even they were subject to severe restrictions. The Dutch were confined to the tiny artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki harbour, where they lived in conditions that resembled a comfortable prison more than a trading post. They were forbidden from bringing women, banned from practicing Christianity, and required to participate in ceremonies that deliberately humiliated their religious beliefs. The fact that they accepted these conditions demonstrates just how profitable the Japan trade was, though it also reveals something about Dutch pragmatism that would make any modern business consultant proud. Perhaps even more significantly, Japanese citizens were forbidden from leaving the country on penalty of death, and those who had gone abroad were prohibited from returning. This meant that Japan became not just a closed country but a locked one, where the population was essentially imprisoned within their own borders. The few exceptions were carefully controlled. Some fishermen were allowed to trade with nearby islands, and the Satsuma domain was permitted limited contact with the Ryukyu kingdom, but these interactions were strictly monitored and regulated. The results of this isolation were remarkable and contradictory. On one hand, Japan achieved a level of internal peace and stability that was unprecedented in its history. The Edo period saw no major wars, few rebellions, and a flourishing of culture and economic development that transformed Japanese society. On the other hand, the country fell increasingly behind the outside world in terms of military technology, scientific knowledge, and industrial development, creating vulnerabilities that would eventually prove catastrophic. Economically, the Edo period witnessed extraordinary growth and innovation despite, or perhaps because of, its isolation from foreign markets. The population grew from approximately 12 million in 1600 to over 30 million by the mid-18th century. Agricultural productivity increased through the introduction of new crops, improved tools, and more intensive farming methods. A sophisticated network of roads, canals, and coastal shipping connected the major cities and allowed for efficient distribution of goods throughout the country. The urban centers of Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto became among the largest cities in the world by the 18th century, with Edo probably housing over 1 million people, making it larger than London or Paris at the time. These cities developed complex economies based on crafts, services, and trade, supported by the constant movement of daimyo retinues travelling to and from the capital under the Sankin-Kotai system. Perhaps most remarkably, Japan developed what was probably the world's first consumer culture during the Edo period. The merchant class, despite their low official status, accumulated substantial wealth and began spending it on luxury goods, entertainment, and cultural pursuits. This led to the development of new forms of art, literature, and theatre specifically designed to appeal to merchant tastes rather than aristocratic sensibilities. The cultural flowering of the Edo period produced innovations that would define Japanese identity for centuries to come. Kabuki theatre emerged as a popular entertainment featuring elaborate costumes, dramatic plots, and actors who became celebrities in their own right. The pleasure quarters of cities like Yoshiwara became centers of sophisticated urban culture, where courtesans were expected to be accomplished in poetry, music, and conversation as well as their more basic professional services. Literature thrived with new forms like the ukiyo-zoshi, realistic novels that depicted contemporary urban life, and the development of haiku poetry reached new heights under masters like Matsuo Basho. Woodblock printing allowed for the mass production of books, making literature accessible to a much broader audience than ever before. The famous ukiyo-e woodblock prints, depicting everything from kabuki actors to landscapes to erotic scenes, created a visual culture that would eventually influence Western artists like Van Gogh and Monet. Education also flourished during this period, with Japan achieving literacy rates that were probably among the highest in the world by the mid-19th century. Private schools called terakoya, often run by Buddhist temples, provided basic education to children from all social classes. More advanced education was available through domain schools for samurai and private academies that taught various subjects including Confucian classics, mathematics, and even Dutch learning, which was the study of European knowledge filtered through Dutch sources. The irony of sakoku was that while Japan was officially closed to foreign influence, there was actually a thriving underground interest in Western knowledge among Japanese intellectuals. Dutch learning, or rangaku, became a legitimate field of study, allowing Japanese scholars to access European developments in medicine, astronomy, geography, and natural sciences. Books were imported through the Dutch connection and carefully translated, creating a small but influential community of Japanese scholars who understood that their country was falling behind the outside world in crucial areas. By the early 19th century, however, the isolation system was coming under increasing pressure. Russian expeditions had begun probing Japan's northern borders, and British and American ships were increasingly present in Pacific waters. The shogunate issued increasingly desperate edicts demanding that all foreign ships be driven away, but the reality was that Japan lacked the military capability to enforce these orders against modern Western naval forces. The crisis came to a head on July 8, 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy sailed into Edo Bay with 4 warships, including 2 steam-powered vessels that the Japanese had never seen before. These black ships, as the Japanese called them because of their dark hulls and the smoke pouring from their stacks, represented a technological gap so enormous that resistance seemed futile. Perry's mission was straightforward. He carried a letter from President Millard Fillmore demanding that Japan open its ports to American ships for trade and provisions. The United States had several motivations for this aggressive diplomacy. American whaling ships operating in the North Pacific needed safe harbors and supply bases. The recent acquisition of California had made trans-Pacific trade routes more important, and there were recurring incidents where shipwrecked American sailors had been mistreated or imprisoned by Japanese authorities. Perry's approach was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Rather than attempting to negotiate immediately, he delivered the American demands and announced that he would return in 1 year for a reply, giving the Japanese government time to consider the overwhelming implications of what they had witnessed. The black ships had effortlessly sailed past all Japanese defences, positioned themselves within cannon range of the capital, and demonstrated a level of technological superiority that made military resistance seem suicidal. When Perry returned in February 1854 with an even larger fleet of 8 ships, the Japanese government had little choice but to negotiate. The resulting Treaty of Kanagawa, signed on March 31st, 1854, was relatively modest in its immediate terms. It opened the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate to American ships, guaranteed the safety of shipwrecked sailors, and established the possibility of an American consul in Japan, but it also included a most favoured nation clause that would automatically extend any concessions made to other countries to the United States as well. The treaty was Japan's first formal diplomatic agreement with a Western power since the early 17th century, and it marked the beginning of the end of the sakoku system. Other Western nations quickly followed the American example, negotiating their own treaties that gradually opened more ports and expanded foreign access to Japanese markets. The carefully constructed isolation that had protected Japan for over 2 centuries was crumbling in the face of superior Western military technology and diplomatic pressure. The forced opening of Japan exposed the fundamental weakness of the Tokugawa system. It had created stability and prosperity by avoiding challenges, but when those challenges could no longer be avoided, the government lacked the flexibility and resources to respond effectively. The samurai class, supposedly the military elite of Japan, proved unable to defend their country against foreign pressure. The rigid social hierarchy that had maintained order for centuries suddenly seemed obsolete in a world where technological innovation and economic dynamism mattered more than hereditary status. The final decades of Tokugawa rule, known as the Bakumatsu period, were marked by increasing political instability, foreign pressure, and growing awareness that Japan would have to undergo fundamental changes to survive in the modern world. The great experiment in isolation had produced remarkable cultural achievements and internal development. but it had also left Japan vulnerable to external pressure that its traditional institutions could not handle. The stage was set for another dramatic transformation in Japanese history. Chapter 5: Modernization at Lightning Speed, Meiji to World War. As we move into the final phase of our journey through Japanese history, we witness one of the most remarkable transformations in human civilization. In the span of less than 50 years, Japan would evolve from a feudal island nation that had been forcibly opened by foreign warships into a modern industrial power capable of defeating major European empires. This breathtaking metamorphosis, driven by a combination of desperation, determination, and sheer audacity, would fundamentally alter not only Japan but the entire balance of power in the world. The catalyst for this transformation was the Meiji Restoration of 1868, a political revolution that was both more and less dramatic than its name suggests. More dramatic because it completely overthrew the social and political system that had governed Japan for over 2 centuries, and less dramatic because the actual transfer of power happened with remarkably little violence. The young Emperor Mutsuhito, who took the reign name Meiji, meaning enlightened rule, was essentially installed by a coalition of samurai from domains that had long opposed the Tokugawa, particularly Satsuma and Choshu. The coup itself was almost anticlimactically swift. On January 3rd, 1868, forces from these domains simply announced that imperial rule was restored and the shogunate was abolished. The last shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, had already been politically weakened by the Perry crisis and mounting pressure from both foreign powers and domestic critics. Rather than fight a hopeless civil war, he resigned his authority to the emperor, though this gracious gesture was followed by brief military conflicts as some Tokugawa loyalists attempted to resist the new order. What made the Meiji Restoration truly revolutionary was not the change of government but the comprehensive transformation that followed. The new leaders, mostly young samurai in their 20s and 30s who had been minor figures in the old system, faced a daunting challenge: how to build a modern nation-state capable of defending itself against Western imperialism while maintaining Japanese independence and identity. Their solution was breathtakingly ambitious. They would study, adapt, and ultimately surpass Western civilization at its own game. The Charter Oath issued by the new government in April 1868 set out principles that would have seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The government promised to seek knowledge from around the world, abolish outdated customs, and base all actions on public discussion rather than arbitrary rule. Most dramatically, it declared that all classes, high and low, shall unite in vigorously carrying out the administration of affairs of state, effectively promising to abandon the rigid social hierarchy that had defined Japanese society for centuries. The new government's first priority was political consolidation. The Han system was abolished in 1871 and replaced with prefectures controlled by the central government. The daimyo were pensioned off and their private armies disbanded. Even more radical was the abolition of the samurai class itself, with former samurai incorporated into government service or compensated for abandoning their hereditary privileges. The ban on wearing swords in 1876 symbolically marked Japan's abandonment of its feudal past. The government's commitment to modernization extended to every aspect of society, beginning with education. A national school system was established in 1872 with the ambitious goal of ensuring that every Japanese child, regardless of social background, would receive at least 6 years of formal education. This was revolutionary not only in its scope, but in its content. The new curriculum emphasized practical subjects like mathematics, science, and geography rather than the classical Chinese texts that had previously dominated Japanese learning. By the end of the Meiji period, Japan had achieved literacy rates that rivaled or exceeded those of most Western nations. This educational revolution was crucial to Japan's rapid industrialization, providing the skilled workforce necessary for modern manufacturing and the informed citizenry required for effective governance. It also helped create a sense of shared national identity among people who had previously thought of themselves primarily as belonging to specific domains or social classes. The government's approach to economic modernization was systematically aggressive. Rather than waiting for private enterprise, the state built model factories and infrastructure projects. Government facilities like the Tomioka Silk Mill demonstrated modern production techniques while training Japanese workers. Railroad construction was particularly transformative, with the first Tokyo-Yokohama line completed in 1872, leading to an extensive national rail network that unified the country, both economically and psychologically. Foreign expertise played a crucial role in Japan's modernization. The government hired over 3,000 foreign specialists to teach everything from military tactics to industrial engineering, but carefully ensured these experts trained Japanese replacements to avoid permanent dependence. Equally important were Japanese missions sent abroad, most notably the Iwakura Embassy of 1871 to 1873, which spent 2 years studying Western institutions and providing reports that influenced policy for decades. The military modernization program was particularly intensive, driven by the government's awareness that Japan's survival depended on its ability to defend itself against Western imperialism. The traditional samurai armies were replaced by a modern conscript force modelled on European examples, with universal military service introduced in 1873. This was deeply unpopular among both samurai, who lost their monopoly on warfare, and peasants, who resented being drafted, but it created a national army loyal to the emperor rather than to local lords. The new military proved its effectiveness during several domestic crises, most notably the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877. This conflict pitted the modern conscript army against traditional samurai forces led by Saigo Takamori, one of the original architects of the Meiji Restoration, who had become disillusioned with the government's westernizing policies. The decisive victory of the imperial forces over the samurai rebels symbolically marked the end of Japan's feudal age and the triumph of its modernizing agenda. By the 1890s, the Meiji government felt confident enough to test its new capabilities against foreign opponents. The target was China, Japan's ancient cultural mentor, which was now seen as an obstacle to Japanese expansion in Korea. The First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 would demonstrate just how successfully Japan had transformed itself from a feudal society into a modern military power. The war began ostensibly over competing influences in Korea, where both China and Japan had strategic interests. When the Korean government requested Chinese assistance to suppress the Donghak Peasant Rebellion, Japan responded by sending its own forces, creating a confrontation that escalated into full-scale war. What shocked the world was not that Japan won, but how completely and decisively it defeated the much larger Chinese empire. Japanese forces proved superior to their Chinese counterparts in every aspect of modern warfare. The Japanese army was better trained, better equipped, and better led than the Chinese forces, while the Japanese navy dominated the seas with modern warships operated by skilled crews. The war culminated in the capture of the supposedly impregnable fortress of Port Arthur and the annihilation of the Chinese fleet at the Battle of the Yalu River. The Treaty of Shimonoseki, signed in April 1895, marked Japan's emergence as a regional power and demonstrated the success of its modernization program. China was forced to recognize Korean independence, cede Taiwan to Japan, pay a massive indemnity, and grant Japan trading privileges. Perhaps most importantly, the war established Japan as the first non-Western nation to defeat a major Asian power using Western military technology and organization. However, Japan's triumph was immediately complicated by the intervention of European powers. Russia, Germany, and France, concerned about Japanese expansion threatening their own interests in East Asia, forced Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur to China in exchange for additional financial compensation. This triple intervention was a humiliating reminder that Japan was not yet strong enough to resist European pressure, and created lasting resentment that would influence Japanese policy for decades. The lesson Japan drew from this experience was that it needed to become even stronger and find Western allies to balance against potential enemies. The Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902 provided the security guarantee that allowed Japan to pursue its next major conflict with confidence. Britain, concerned about Russian expansion in East Asia, agreed to remain neutral if Japan fought Russia, and to join Japan if any other power intervened on Russia's behalf. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 represented the ultimate test of Japan's modernization program. Russia was a major European power with vast resources and a population many times larger than Japan's. If Japan could defeat Russia, it would prove that its rapid transformation had succeeded beyond the most optimistic expectations of the Meiji leaders. Japan's strategy was to win quickly before Russia could bring its full strength to bear. The war began with a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, followed by the landing of Japanese armies in Korea and Manchuria. Japanese forces consistently outfought their Russian opponents, capturing Port Arthur after a bloody siege, defeating the Russian army at Mukden, and culminating in the annihilation of the Russian Baltic fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. The Battle of Tsushima was perhaps the most decisive naval victory in modern history. Admiral Togo Heihachiro's fleet completely destroyed the Russian squadron, sinking or capturing virtually every ship while suffering minimal losses themselves. This victory demonstrated not only Japanese tactical brilliance but also the effectiveness of their naval construction program and officer training system. The war ended with the Treaty of Portsmouth in September 1905, mediated by American President Theodore Roosevelt. Japan gained control of the Liaodong Peninsula and Port Arthur, the southern half of Sakhalin Island, and predominant influence in Korea. More importantly, Japan had defeated a major European power and established itself as the dominant force in East Asia. The international reaction to Japan's victory was mixed, but universally shocked. Western observers had not expected an Asian nation to be capable of such military effectiveness against a European power. Some saw Japan's success as proof that Western civilization could be successfully adopted by non-Western peoples, while others worried about the rise of a new challenge to European dominance in Asia. For Japan itself, victory in the Russo-Japanese War marked the completion of its transformation from feudal isolation to modern great power status. In less than 40 years since the Meiji Restoration, Japan had created modern governmental institutions, industrialized its economy, built powerful military forces, and proven its ability to compete with the world's major powers. The country that had been forcibly opened by Perry's black ships was now capable of projecting its own power across the Pacific. However, success also brought new challenges and temptations. Japan's victories had been achieved through enormous sacrifices by its people, who had endured heavy taxation, military conscription, and rapid social change in service of national strength. The question now was whether Japan would use its newfound power responsibly, or whether success would feed ambitions that might ultimately prove self-destructive. The seeds of future conflicts were already visible in Japan's approach to its new empire. The annexation of Korea in 1910 and the expansion of influence in Manchuria suggested that Japan was adopting the imperial methods of the Western powers it had initially sought to resist. The very success of Japan's modernization program had created a powerful military-industrial complex with its own momentum and interests that might not always align with the broader welfare of the Japanese people or their neighbors. By the end of the Meiji era in 1912, Japan had achieved the goals set by the Charter Oath of seeking knowledge from around the world and strengthening the foundations of imperial rule. The country had successfully defended its independence against Western imperialism and had emerged as a major power in its own right. But the methods used to achieve this success had also transformed Japan in ways that the original Meiji leaders might not have anticipated or desired. The Japan that entered the 20th century was a modern nation-state with powerful military forces, advanced industrial capabilities, and growing international ambitions. It had proven that rapid modernization was possible without Western colonization and had provided a model that would inspire nationalist movements throughout Asia. But it had also demonstrated that the acquisition of power could be as dangerous as its absence, and that the pursuit of national strength might require sacrifices that would test the very values that had motivated the original transformation. Chapter 6: The Economic Miracle and Modern Japan. Our journey through Japanese history concludes with perhaps the most extraordinary transformation of all: Japan's rise from the ashes of World War II to become one of the world's most prosperous and technologically advanced nations. This final chapter tells the story of a country that experienced the ultimate defeat, only to achieve what historians call the Japanese economic miracle, fundamentally altering not only Japan itself but the entire global economy in the process. The Japan that emerged from World War II in August 1945 was a nation in ruins. American bombing campaigns had destroyed over 60 cities, including the atomic devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Industrial capacity had been reduced by 50%, transportation networks were shattered, and millions of Japanese were homeless, hungry, and utterly demoralized. The emperor, once considered divine, had announced Japan's surrender on radio, his voice breaking the spell of invincibility that had sustained the nation for centuries. Into this devastation stepped General Douglas MacArthur, appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers and effectively the uncrowned ruler of Japan from 1945 to 1951. MacArthur's occupation was unprecedented in both scope and ambition. Rather than simply preventing future Japanese aggression, the Americans aimed to completely transform Japan into a peaceful, democratic society that could never again threaten world peace. It was social engineering on a scale that made the Meiji Restoration look cautious. MacArthur approached his task with characteristic grandiosity, seeing himself as Japan's liberator rather than its conqueror. Remarkably, this view was shared by many Japanese who had grown to despise the military leaders who had led them into catastrophic defeat. The general became a beloved figure among ordinary Japanese, receiving hundreds of thousands of fan letters from people who saw American occupation as preferable to rule by their own discredited militarists. One letter writer called him the Great Apostle of Humanitarian Love, a title that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The occupation's first priority was demilitarization and democratization. Japan's armed forces were completely disbanded, with over 6 million soldiers and sailors demobilized and sent home to an uncertain future. The military-industrial complex was dismantled, weapons were destroyed, and anyone associated with the war effort was purged from positions of authority. The famous Peace Constitution of 1947 went even further, including Article 9's renunciation of war as a sovereign right of Japan, and the pledge never to maintain military forces for anything other than self-defense. The new constitution also fundamentally altered Japanese society by establishing democratic institutions, guaranteeing civil rights, and promoting gender equality. Women gained the right to vote, hereditary titles were abolished, and the emperor was transformed from a divine ruler into a symbolic figurehead. Land reform redistributed property from large landowners to tenant farmers, creating a rural middle class that would become the backbone of Japan's post-war stability. Labor unions were legalized and encouraged, giving workers unprecedented rights to organize and strike. Initially, American economic policy toward Japan was punitive, designed to prevent the country from ever again becoming a military threat. High taxation, restrictions on industrial development, and the breaking up of large corporations were intended to keep Japan poor and dependent. However, by 1948, the emergence of Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union and the looming communist victory in China forced American policymakers to reconsider their approach. A strong Japan began to seem like a necessary bulwark against communist expansion in East Asia. The Korean War, which began in June 1950, proved to be the catalyst for Japan's economic recovery. The United States needed a secure supply base for its forces fighting in Korea, and Japan was perfectly positioned to provide everything from military vehicles to medical supplies. Japanese factories that had been idle suddenly found themselves running at full capacity, producing goods for the American military. The war generated over $3 billion in military procurement spending, providing exactly the economic stimulus Japan needed to begin its remarkable recovery. The wartime production surge revealed that Japan's industrial base, despite the devastation, retained crucial capabilities that could be rapidly rebuilt. Companies like Toyota, which had been struggling to survive, suddenly received massive orders for trucks and other military equipment. Steel mills fired up their furnaces, shipyards returned to full operation, and thousands of unemployed workers found jobs in factories producing materials for the Korean conflict. The irony was unmistakable. Japan's economic resurrection was being funded by another war, this time one in which Japan served as America's workshop rather than its enemy. American policy toward Japan shifted dramatically during this period, guided by what became known as the reverse course. Instead of keeping Japan weak, the United States now wanted to build it up as a reliable ally. The Dodge Line economic reforms of 1949 had stabilized Japan's finances by eliminating inflation and fixing the exchange rate at 360 yen to the dollar, a deliberately favorable rate that would boost Japanese exports. When the occupation ended in 1952 with the Treaty of San Francisco, Japan was already positioned to begin its economic miracle. The foundations for rapid growth had been carefully laid. Japan possessed several crucial advantages: a highly educated workforce, a strong tradition of industrial organization, and access to the latest American technology through licensing agreements. The devastation of the war had eliminated obsolete equipment and allowed Japanese companies to rebuild with the most modern machinery available. American protection meant that Japan could spend almost nothing on defense, channeling resources instead into productive investment. The growth that followed was staggering by any historical standard. Between 1955 and 1973, Japan's gross national product grew at an average annual rate of over 10%, with some years reaching 15% growth. By comparison, the United States and European economies were growing at 3 to 4% annually. Japan's economy doubled in size every 7 years during the 1960s, transforming the country from a war-torn developing nation into an industrial powerhouse in a single generation. This growth was driven by a unique combination of government planning and private enterprise. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry, or MITI, coordinated industrial policy by identifying promising sectors, providing subsidies and low-interest loans, and protecting domestic companies from foreign competition until they were strong enough to compete internationally. This approach, sometimes called Japan Inc., combined the efficiency of market mechanisms with strategic government guidance in a way that challenged Western assumptions about economic development. The Japanese government also implemented the Income Doubling Plan in 1960, an ambitious program that aimed to double personal incomes within a decade. Remarkably, this goal was achieved ahead of schedule, transforming Japan from a poor country where people were still dying of starvation in 1950 to a middle-class society by the mid-1960s. The psychological impact was enormous. Japanese citizens who had lived through defeat and occupation suddenly found themselves more prosperous than they had ever imagined possible. Japanese companies developed distinctive management practices that contributed to their success. The lifetime employment system created loyal workforces, while quality control techniques and just-in-time production methods revolutionized manufacturing efficiency. Large industrial groups called kairetsu combined banks, trading companies, and manufacturers in cooperative networks that could mobilize resources more effectively than their Western competitors. These methods would eventually be studied and copied around the world. The cultural foundation of Japan's economic success was equally important as its institutional innovations. The concept of kaizen, or continuous improvement, became embedded in corporate culture, encouraging workers at every level to seek ways to enhance productivity and quality. Company loyalty reached levels that astonished foreign observers, with employees often staying with the same firm for their entire careers and participating in company songs, exercises, and recreational activities that reinforced group solidarity. This social cohesion, rooted in traditional Japanese values, proved remarkably compatible with modern industrial organization. The transformation was visible everywhere. Tokyo, which had been reduced to rubble in 1945, became a gleaming modern metropolis, hosting the 1964 Olympics, an event that symbolically marked Japan's return to the international community as a respected member. Bullet trains began operating between Tokyo and Osaka in time for the Olympics, demonstrating Japanese technological prowess to the world. Consumer goods like televisions, refrigerators, and washing machines became standard in Japanese households, creating the mass consumption society that economists consider essential for sustained growth. Japan's export industries proved remarkably successful at conquering international markets. Japanese cars, initially dismissed by American consumers as cheap and unreliable, gradually gained acceptance through superior fuel efficiency and build quality. Electronics companies like Sony and Panasonic became household names worldwide, while Japanese shipbuilders dominated global markets. By the late 1960s, Made in Japan had changed from a symbol of poor quality to a mark of advanced technology and reliability. The social costs of rapid growth were significant, but generally accepted by a population grateful for prosperity after decades of hardship. Working hours were long, living conditions in cities were crowded, and pollution became a serious problem as environmental concerns took second place to economic development. The traditional Japanese family structure came under pressure as men devoted themselves entirely to their companies, while women were expected to manage households and raise children. Yet opinion polls consistently showed high levels of satisfaction with the direction the country was heading. By the early 1970s, Japan had achieved something unprecedented in modern history. A non-Western nation had successfully adopted Western technology and organizational methods while maintaining its cultural identity, creating prosperity that rivaled or exceeded that of its former occupiers. Japan became the world's second-largest economy in 1968, a position it would maintain for decades. The country that had been forced to open by Perry's black ships in 1853 had become a technological and economic superpower. The oil crisis of 1973 marked the end of the era of double-digit growth, but Japan adapted better than most developed nations. Energy-efficient manufacturing and export diversification allowed Japanese companies to maintain their competitiveness, even as energy costs soared. The country that had virtually no natural resources proved that human resources and technological innovation could overcome geographical disadvantages in the modern global economy. Japan's success had profound implications far beyond its own borders. It demonstrated that rapid economic development was possible without Western colonization or communist revolution, providing a model that would inspire developing nations throughout Asia and beyond. The Japanese approach to industrial policy, corporate organization, and technological development influenced economic thinking worldwide and contributed to the broader phenomenon of East Asian economic growth that would reshape the global economy in the following decades. Perhaps most remarkably, Japan achieved this transformation while maintaining political stability and social cohesion. Unlike many developing nations, Japan managed rapid change without military coups, civil wars, or social breakdown. The democratic institutions established during the occupation proved resilient, and Japan became a reliable ally of the United States and a constructive member of the international community. The story of modern Japan represents one of the most successful national transformations in human history. From the traumatic opening by Perry's expedition to the devastation of World War II to the economic miracle of the post-war decades, Japan repeatedly demonstrated an extraordinary capacity for adaptation and renewal. The island nation that began our journey as a collection of rice-farming villages had become a technological powerhouse whose innovations would shape the modern world. Today's Japan, facing new challenges of demographic change and global competition, continues to evolve while maintaining the core characteristics that enabled its remarkable journey: a commitment to education, technological innovation, and social cooperation. The aging population and declining birth rate present obstacles that would have seemed unimaginable during the growth decades, when Japan's greatest concern was managing rapid expansion rather than demographic contraction. Yet the same adaptability that allowed Japan to transform itself from feudal isolation to industrial powerhouse suggests that new solutions will emerge. The lessons of Japanese history suggest that while change is inevitable, the ability to adapt while preserving essential values may be the key to long-term survival and prosperity in an ever-changing world. From the Jomon pottery makers who first shaped clay on these islands to the modern engineers designing robots and artificial intelligence, the Japanese story has been one of continuous innovation within enduring cultural frameworks. The journey from rice paddies to bullet trains, from samurai swords to semiconductors, represents not just economic development but a unique model of how societies can embrace modernity without losing their souls. And with that adaptability, Japan's story continues to unfold, adding new chapters to one of history's most remarkable tales of transformation and resilience. The island nation that once feared foreign influence now influences the world through its technology, culture, and example. In anime and automobiles, in poetry and precision manufacturing, in traditional arts and cutting-edge science, Japan has created a civilization that is both distinctively Japanese and unmistakably modern, proving that national identity and global engagement need not be mutually exclusive in our interconnected world.